axle into the front hub. On the filed side, let about 1.5 inches stick out beyond the hub. Hold the hub up to the wheel directly above the axle so that the bottom end of the filed axle is aligned approximately with the top of the rim. Take your long level and hold it up to the upper lip of the hub. Hold the other end to the handlebar tube. Once it's level, mark underneath the level on the tube. Measure the thickness of your square tubing. Then measure that distance down from the mark you just made and make a second mark. Holding one end of the measuring tape at the dropouts, hold the other end to the second mark you just made, like this. Note the total measurement and also the measurement where the tape bends. Cut a piece of rebar to the total measurement. Bend it using the pipe at the same point where the tape bent and to the same angle. Check this piece on the bike. If it fits, make an identical piece and weld them both on. Cut a piece of plywood, roughly 1 foot by 1 foot. Place it across the rebar, centered left to right and also roughly centered above the wheel's axle. Mark on the rebar where the edge of the plywood is. Take the tubing and place it on the rebar under where the plywood will go. Mark 2 places towards the outer edges of each piece where bolt holes will be drilled. Mark its placement on the rebar. Also, mark to cut any excess tubing that would hang out beyond the edges of the plywood. Using the drill press or the handheld drill, drill holes slightly wider than your bolts. Weld the tubing on. Take your hole saw and drill a hole out of the big tire. Go for the flattest spot you can find. What you want is a thick piece of circular rubber. It's good to cut a few to be safe. Take whichever piece of rubber looks the most circular and centered and grind off any excess pieces. Pop this piece of rubber onto the bottom of the filed axle. If it doesn't fit, widen its hole some and/or file down the other end of the axle. Put the plywood back onto the square tubing, then hold the hub underneath the plywood directly above the wheel's axle. Where you hold it should also approximate the distance that the hub will be from the wheel when the rubber piece is actually making contact with the tire. Draw a mark on the plywood around the top of the axle. Use the hole saw to drill out a hole with the marked point as its center. Compare your wood screws to the holes in the hub. If they're small enough to go through, good. If not, then widen 4 holes with the drill in as close to a square formation as possible. Fit the hub underneath the plywood through the hole. Using a pencil, mark the 4 holes on the underside of the plywood. Pre-drill all 4 holes with a drill bit slightly smaller than the width of your screws. Put the hub back on the plywood. Align the holes and screw the hub to the plywood. Take apart the base of the blender, remove all the innards, and unscrew the circular fitting from the base. Cut the heads off of your 4 scrap 2-inch screws. Stick these 4 screws into the 4 holes in the bottom of the circular fitting with their tips facing out. It's important that they be the exact same length. Put the circular fitting upside down on the blender. Then place the filed axle into the hole in the bottom of the blender. Make sure that the axle fits well into the blender and that the blender spins easily. If it doesn't, move it around until it does. When it does, then press down on the plywood. Drill out holes on the 4 marks that the screws just made into the plywood. The holes should be slightly wider than the screws you'll use. Remove the chopped up screws from the blender base, then put the axle back together with the blender. Check the gap between the plywood and the circular fitting. Fill this gap with washers. Once the gap between plywood and plastic has been closed, then use your 4 good 2-inch screws to attach the circular fitting to the plywood. Let the air out of the tire. Put the blender plywood unit onto the machine so that the piece of rubber meets the tire. You may need to move the rubber up or down to maximize contact with the tire. Mark through the holes in the underside of the square tubing onto the plywood. Remove the plywood and drill through the marks with a bit slightly wider than your bolts. Bolt the plywood to the bike. If your washers are too wide to let the blender fit snugly in the circular fitting, try loosening the screws and moving the washers over. If that doesn't work, use something smaller, like the 1/8-inch washers or some small nuts. Adjust air in the tire until a desired level of friction is met. You want it to spin freely and easily, especially when there's stuff in the blender. Adjusting the air pressure in the tire can help you get the right amount of friction. Your bicycle-powered blender is done. Now, make delicious smoothies.